So first of all, thank you so much. And thank you for expressing this gratitude and for forming those good wishes. The job I'm doing is not one where you get a lot of gratitude. And thank you also for inviting me, Volker, to this ECB and its Watchers conference, or should I call it the Conference of the Highly Sensible People. You're not laughing very much. Now, given that it's St. Patrick's Day today, there must be a few Irish in the room. I would quote an Irish poet, Brendan Behan, who said, "It's a good deed to always forgive a bad joke." Keep that in mind. You see what I'm wearing here? It has a meaning, and it reflects, unfortunately, developments that we're seeing and that you alluded to, Volker. Thank you very much for putting everything that we do, all of us in our respective position, in the context of what we are watching and what other people are suffering. It is clear to all of us that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which cannot even be characterized, has cast a shadow over Europe. It has called into question the fundamental tenets of our security, which was based on territorial integrity and sovereignty, respect for international law and human rights. And it has also revealed our collective vulnerability born out of economic dependence on hostile actors. As Europe's leaders declared last week, this war of aggression constitutes a tectonic shift in European history. The ECB's Governing Council stands by the people of Ukraine, who have been subjected to this horrific act of aggression. As the central bank of the euro area, we play our part in the common response. We implement the sanctions decided by the EU, and we will take whatever action is needed to secure price stability and safeguard financial stability. It takes us in uncharted territories, I can assure you, making sure that we play our part so that the Ukrainian refugees can actually exchange hryvnia into hard currency that they can then use for their basic needs, is one of the areas, for instance, where we are trying to apply as much creativity within the parameters of the treaty in order not to violate the law. That's just to give you an idea of where we have to venture in the current times. The euro area economy has faced a number of challenges over the last months. The rapid economic recovery from the pandemic emergency has been coupled with higher energy prices even before the war, supply-side constraints and price pressure. Now, owing to the war, Europeans will, in the short term, confront higher inflation and lower economic growth. Accordingly, the challenges facing monetary policy are changing. We are unlikely to return to the same inflation dynamics that we saw before the pandemic. We have, as a result, begun adjusting policy so that when the necessary conditions are satisfied, we can take additional steps towards policy normalization. But we are also aware of the underlying risks caused by the war and the uncertainty it is creating in all directions. And for this reason, all our monetary policy decisions in the months to come will necessarily be informed by the economic fallout from the war and be data dependent. As Bertrand Russell said, we face an eternal test of, I quote, how to live without certainty and yet without being paralyzed by hesitation. In that spirit, the best contribution that monetary policy can make in today's circumstances is to provide clear guideposts regarding how we will react under uncertainty. The Governing Council of the ECB last week agreed that its response would be guided by 3 principles: optionality, gradualism, and flexibility. So what I would like to do in the very generous time that was given to me this morning is address 3 particular areas. First of all, how we saw inflation dynamics developing before the war began, and it is important, it's not just the past, it informs the present and the future. Second, how the war is expected to affect the outlook for inflation and growth. And third, how our recent decisions increase our optionality while embedding gradualism and flexibility. So, how did we see inflation dynamics developing before the war started? The ongoing exit from the pandemic had created an environment of exceptional volatility. There are few episodes in history where conditions in the economy have changed so quickly. After one of the steepest contractions in GDP ever recorded in peacetime, we have seen the steepest recovery in GDP ever recorded. Employment has never fallen so fast and then rebounded so quickly. This remarkable turnaround was largely attributable to the strong and coordinated policy response from monetary, fiscal, regulatory, and supervision authorities, all of which helped to preserve jobs and incomes and laid the foundation for the economy to recover so quickly. But that has produced 2 effects on inflation. First, volatile growth has led to volatile short-term inflation. Policy actions have protected demand, but could not fully offset the legacy effects of the pandemic on supply. This has been especially noticeable in the prices of energy, in the price of food, in the price of durable goods. Since June last year, energy and food account for, on average, around 2/3 of inflation, with supply failing to catch up with demand as the world economy reopened. Durable goods inflation is 16 times higher today than it was pre-COVID in February 2020. Consumers in advanced economies have spent more on goods relative to services, while producers have been constrained by zero-COVID policies in parts of Asia, major provider of consumer goods worldwide. This is the famous example of those who no longer belong to the fitness club, have desperately tried to buy a stationary bicycle and had to pay a much higher price and wait for delivery in time. Well, not so much in time. In many ways, the best analogy for what we have seen is the spurt in inflation that typically accompanies the end of wars, when demand for consumer goods runs ahead of sluggish supply as firms are slow to adapt to normal conditions. For example, between 1945 and 1947, the price of crude oil in the United States increased by 80%. Because car ownership became widespread, but the supply of gas, petrol, could not keep up. But behind these short-term factors, we have also seen a second effect, an improving medium-term inflation outlook. Setting aside the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war, the economy has been on track to achieve a greater utilization of resources and a tighter labor market than before the pandemic. Output gap turned positive, labor slack reduced significantly. The last time the euro area saw unemployment rates at today's level was in the 70s. Inflation expectations have also converged to our target of 2% across a range of measures, while inflation has become broader and measures of underlying inflation have risen. These measures have been influenced by energy prices and supply bottlenecks, but with pipeline pressure swelling, the upward impact may last for a while. An indicator of sticky price inflation, which captures items whose prices are changed less frequently, rose to 2.9% in December last year. All this suggests that inflation is increasingly likely to stabilize at our 2% target over the medium term. And this was the outlook that led us, in December last year, to start a step-by-step reduction in the pace of our asset purchases. And as you all noticed, we also adjusted our communication in February as the incoming data suggested that inflation was converging even faster towards our medium-term goal. Turn a page. How has now the war affected our inflation and growth outlook? The outbreak of the war has introduced new uncertainty into the outlook. In particular, the short-term factors pushing up inflation are likely to be amplified. Energy prices are expected to stay higher for longer, with gas prices up by 73% since the start of the year and oil prices by up to 44%. The pressure on food inflation is likely to increase. Let's not forget that Russia and Ukraine account for nearly 30% of global wheat exports, and wheat prices are up by more than 30% since the start of the war. Belarus and Russia produce around a third of the world's potash, a key ingredient alongside natural gas in producing fertilizers, which were already in rare supply. Global manufacturing bottlenecks, which had shown some signs of easing at last over the last months, are now also likely to persist in certain sectors, not to mention what's happening in Asia and the new zero-COVID policies applied in certain towns. That will prolong price pressure for durable goods. Just to give you a few examples, Russia is the world's top exporter of palladium, which is a key input for producing catalytic converters and is hard to substitute with other suppliers. Ukraine produces 70% of the world's neon gas, which is critical for the laser lithography process used in semiconductor manufacturing. The euro area is highly dependent on Russia for cobalt and vanadium, which are key for the 3D printing for drone and robotic industries. The ECB's latest baseline projections, which include a first assessment of the impact of the war, see inflation on average at 5.1% this year, with significant increases over the next couple of quarters. In a more severe scenario that has been produced by our staff, inflation might exceed 7% in 2022. But when faced with a supply shock, the key question for monetary policy is whether the effect of the shock on inflation is likely to become persistent. There are several considerations that we need to take into account in the current situation. So it cannot be about, oh yes, monetary policy can deal with demand shock and it cannot do anything about supply shocks. We have to go deeper into this. So allow me to do that for a little while. First of all, as this shock is hitting the economy at a time when inflation is already high, the risk of it infiltrating inflation expectations is greater. We know from research that households' inflation expectations are strongly influenced by the price that they pay for goods that they purchase frequently. What is more frequently purchased than gas and groceries? Second, the war could set in motion new inflationary trends that take a while to play out. There has been much discussion since the pandemic about whether we are seeing a structural break in the inflation regime caused by deglobalization and accelerated decarbonization. Now, the push for, often French quoted, European strategic autonomy is likely to gather steam with deliberate reshoring, close shoring, friend shoring, you've heard all that, of critical supply chains. The energy transition is also likely to speed up as the paths to achieving energy security and climate security now point firmly in the same direction. So that's on the way up. Let's look at other facts. Because at the same time, the war poses significant risks to growth, in particular over the short term. And this could depress medium-term inflation, if it means that the economy returns to full capacity, but much more slowly than expected currently. The main risks are via energy prices and confidence. So let's look at energy first. As the euro area is a net importer of energy, rising energy prices represent a terms of trade tax that transfers purchasing power to the rest of the world, particularly those that actually produce and sell energy. Higher energy prices already created a negative income effect of 1.4% of GDP in the last quarter of 2021, compared with the same period in 2019, which was only partly offset by higher export prices. Historical experience suggests that this effect will likely become stronger now. ECB analysis shows that swings in energy supply have been an important driver of household real income during previous episodes of large energy supply shocks. This was true when OPEC increased oil production in 1986, causing a collapse in energy prices, and this was true as well when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, leading to soaring energy prices. That's for energy. Let's look at confidence now. Households, corporates. Because this conflict might have serious confidence effects through those two channels. First, we had expected household saving rate to normalize this year and support stronger spending. But US research finds that large energy shocks typically lead to precautionary behavior as consumers become more pessimistic. Even before the war, the rise in inflation since last summer seemed to have dented euro area households' expectations about their future financial situation. By the way, whenever I quote research, you will find in my published speech all the right footnotes that will help you find out what the papers are. I'm not inventing here. At a minimum, higher energy prices are likely to eat into the savings households accumulated during the pandemic, diverting them away from non-energy consumption. So transferring this purchasing power outside the euro area, which is not producing energy, or little of it. The ECB's Consumer Expectations Survey shows that last year's energy price spike had already led households to save less and dip into savings more by an amount equal to 1.1 percentage points of income. That's for the households. Let's turn to the corporates now. Business investment could be affected. Major geopolitical events that have increased economic uncertainty in the past, such as the two Gulf Wars and September 11th attack, are found to have foreshadowed declines in investment in advanced economies. These effects, by the way, are reflected in the ECB's staff baseline projection, which sees slower but still relatively robust growth this year at 3.7%, as opposed to the 4.2% forecast that we had before. But in the severe scenario, GDP growth could be lower by up to 1.4 percentage point, as compared to 0.5 percentage point that we have in the baseline. So these competing forces create a wider range of risks around the inflation forecast beyond the near term. And it requires close monitoring of a broad set of real and nominal variables, including various measures of inflation expectations. I'm going to identify 3 for you. We will be looking at more, but those are 3 that I would like to share with you. One such variable is the response by fiscal policy. Fiscal policy can help buffer the war's adverse effects on growth, while its impact on inflation depends on the nature of the support measures that are adopted. Many governments, we read it on a daily basis now, are currently taking decisive actions to protect real incomes, particularly for those most affected by rising energy prices. And we are also likely to see more investment into the green transition and, new phenomenon, defense capacity, including in this country, as you well noted, Volker. A second variable that we will be looking at is changes in household savings. If inflation expectations start to become de-anchored, that could come together with households front-loading their consumption. Why don't I buy a car today because it's bound to increase in a few months' time? Reducing, therefore, the amount they save by more than would be necessary to pay for higher energy bills. But if savings start rising and consumption is deferred, it could indicate that growth effects are likely to prevail. Third variable is the behavior of wages. In general, when the inflation target is 2% and productivity growth is around 1%, average wage increases at around 3% would be consistent with our on-target inflation. If wages were to notably and persistently exceed that benchmark, even as growth was slowing, it could be an indication that household inflation expectations are drifting upwards. But if wages were to fail to catch up sufficiently, for instance, because uncertainty leads to more job protection than wages increases request, and people are more cautious, including unions, households would be exposed to an even stronger squeeze in real income. That could result in a fall in consumption, and it would weaken growth in the medium term. So in the face of that landscape that I've tried to describe for you, flagging those indicators and signals that we will be particularly attentive to, how do we use those three principles that I have mentioned, that of optionality, gradualism, and flexibility, and how will that serve us? So when the Governing Council met last week, we weighed these competing forces. And we concluded that the challenges facing monetary policy are changing. We have, indeed, become increasingly confident that the inflation dynamics of the past decades are unlikely to return. As a result, we decided it was appropriate to continue dialing back our net asset purchases, which were intended to combat an environment where disinflationary risks dominate. But we also agreed that we needed a policy framework tailored to the current environment of heightened uncertainty and the new challenges it presents. And to that end, we decided that our policy should be governed by those three principles of optionality, gradualism, and flexibility. So I'm going to address each of the three and explain as well as I can what we meant by that. And I'm sure that there will be more explanation and more speculation about these three. And I will address the issue of normalization at our Sintra conference, by the way, for those of you who are interested. So first, optionality should not be confused with ambiguity. It is about making clear how we will react to a range of scenarios and ensuring that we are poised to react effectively and proportionally, of course, if they materialize. As a result, we have put in place a conditional approach to policy normalization, conveying our reaction function under alternative scenarios. Specifically, if the incoming data support the expectation that the medium-term inflation outlook will not weaken, even after the end of our net asset purchases. We will conclude these purchases in the third quarter of 2022. This increases our optionality by removing obstacles along the potential path of interest rate normalization if our expectations play out. It also gives us more scope to adjust policy in a timely fashion should we see risks of excess inflation extending into the medium term. But at the same time, we also decided that if the outlook was to change and financing conditions become inconsistent with further progress towards our 2% target, we stand ready to adjust the size and/or the duration of our purchases. And in this way, we are keeping open the option to take any necessary measures should the economic consequences of the war escalate and stifle the current economic path. Optionality also means that the path of our policy over the coming months will be data dependent. We will confirm the way forward only once we have more visibility as to whether our expectation for medium-term inflation materializes. But let's not forget that under all scenarios, the two that I have identified, our stock of asset purchases is providing significant accommodation. They will exceed, by the third quarter, based on our scale of purchases as announced, they will exceed 5 trillion euros and will be reinvested even after the end of our net purchases. So that's for optionality. Let me now turn to gradualism. Gradualism is a well-established principle for central banks in times of uncertainty. When faced with uncertainty about the resilience of the economy, it pays to move carefully. In keeping with this, we have adjusted our forward guidance on interest rates to temper any expectations of an abrupt or automatic move on the interest rate front. So we now say that the adjustment of key ECB interest rate will take place, I quote and I emphasize, some time after the end of net purchases. Thank you, that's perfectly appropriate, actually. So taking place sometime after the end of net purchases. This maintains our traditional sequencing logic, but it also gives us extra space if we need it, after we stop purchasing bonds and before we take the next step towards normalization. This will allow us to test whether the convergence of inflation to our target that we project today is robust to current and potential new shocks. Now you might ask you, what is the interval? Well, the length of that interval between these two decisions, to conclude net asset purchases and to move towards normalization, which is another way to say increase rates. The interval between these two decisions will be determined by our strategy and by the three conditions that govern our forward guidance on interest rates. I don't need to repeat the three elements of it, you know it. And we have made clear that future adjustments to rates, when they come, will be gradual. So, optionality, gradualism. I'm moving now to flexibility. It's a special principle for conducting monetary policy in a monetary union, as we must continuously focus on ensuring that policy is transmitted evenly to all parts of the euro area. With diverging initial conditions, exogenous shocks can affect economies asymmetrically. If this leads to financial fragmentation, the transmission of monetary policy can be disrupted or impaired. To reduce uncertainty under these conditions, the Governing Council has reiterated its commitment to flexibility. This means that we are ready to use a wide range of instruments to address fragmentation, including the reinvestment of our portfolio held under the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Programme. If necessary, we can design and deploy new instruments to secure monetary policy transmission as we move along the path of normalization. We have shown in the past that we are capable of that creativity. So at this point, let me conclude. Monetary policy today is facing a new challenge. We are increasingly confident that inflation dynamics over the medium term will not return to the pattern we saw before the pandemic. But we need to manage a shock that in the short term pushes inflation above our target and reduces growth. We have reacted to this new environment by increasing our optionality and emphasizing that we will act gradually and flexibly in order to deliver on our mandate of price stability. We have also outlined a conditional path towards policy normalization if the necessary conditions are satisfied. And at the same time, we are mindful of the risks ahead, and we are ready to revisit our plan if the incoming data requires us to do so. I'd like to finish with a quote. So I'm borrowing this one from Maya Angelou. She may have borrowed it from Benjamin Disraeli, to be checked. So I quote, and this is the state of mind we're in and the determination that we will collectively demonstrate as Governing Council of the ECB. Hoping for the best, prepared for the worst, and unsurprised by anything in between. Thank you very much.